There's a difference running on almost every website you touch that you have bumped into 1,000 times and never once named. It does not block you with a dramatic error. It does not throw up a warning. It simply slows you down quietly at exactly the moment you start moving faster than a person ever could. You feel it as a login that suddenly says, try again later, a search that briefly refuses, an app that pauses when you tap too quickly. It is one of the oldest and least glamorous defenses on the internet, and it is also one of the most important, because it quietly kills a huge share of automated attacks, not with a slammed door, but with a slow, patient, endless no. This is the story of the invisible throttle. The core idea: start with a pattern that sits underneath almost every attack online, because once you see it, the difference becomes obvious. Nearly every form of online abuse depends on doing one small thing an enormous number of times. Guessing a password means trying thousands of guesses. Scraping a site means fetching countless pages. Testing stolen card numbers means running them again and again. Flooding a service means hammering it relentlessly. A single attempt in isolation is almost always harmless and indistinguishable from a normal person. One login try is just a person logging in. One page fetch is just a reader. One card check is just a purchase. The danger lives entirely in the repetition, in the volume, in the speed. Take any of these attacks and slow it to a human pace, and it stops being an attack at all. A password guesser who can only try a few times an hour will never finish. A scraper limited to a handful of pages a minute is just a slow visitor. So the threat is not really the action, it is the rate. And that single observation, that abuse is repetition wearing a disguise, points straight at the cure. The simple defense: if abuse depends on doing something very many times very fast, then the simplest possible defense is to cap how fast anyone is allowed to do it. That is the entire idea of rate limiting. It does not try to judge whether a given action is good or bad. It just refuses to let any single source do the same thing more than a set number of times in a given stretch of time. You can ask, but only so often. Cross the line, and further attempts are politely declined until the clock resets. It is crowd control rather than judgment, and its beauty is that it does not need to understand the attack to blunt it. The counter at the door. The most basic way to picture this is a counter at the door. For each visitor, the system keeps a tally of how many times they have acted within the current window of time, say the last minute. Each action ticks the counter up by 1. When the counter passes the allowed limit, the door closes for that visitor until the window rolls over and the count resets. Simple, cheap, effective, but it has a rough edge. Right at the boundary between two windows, a clever flood can squeeze a burst through the end of one window and the start of the next, briefly doubling up. So the crude counter, while useful, is only the first sketch of the idea. The leaky bucket, a more elegant picture, fixes that, and it is worth holding in your head because it captures the spirit better. Imagine each visitor has a bucket, and every action pours a little water in. The bucket also leaks steadily from a hole in the bottom, draining at a fixed, constant rate. As long as actions arrive at a reasonable pace, the bucket never fills. The water drains as fast as it comes. But if a flood pours in faster than the hole can drain, the bucket overflows, and the overflow is exactly what gets refused. The leak smooths bursts into a steady trickle, allowing a normal rhythm through while clamping hard on anything that tries to rush. The elegance is that it forgives. A person who acts in a quick little flurry and then pauses, the natural shape of real human use, never overflows, because the bucket drains during the pauses. It is only sustained, relentless pressure, the signature of a machine that never rests, that fills the bucket faster than it can empty. So the design quietly distinguishes the bursty rhythm of a human from the flat, tireless flood of automations, without ever having to decide which is which. It is a small idea with a deep effect. What counts as one actor? Now the genuinely hard problem. The one that makes this an art, rather than a recipe. For any of this to work, the system has to decide who counts as a single actor to be limited. The obvious answer is the network address a request comes from, and that is often where it starts. But it is easy to fool. A determined operator can spread their actions across thousands of different addresses, so that no single one ever trips the limit. even though together they form one coordinated flood. So the defender reaches for other signals to bind requests to one true source, characteristics of the connection, signs of the device, patterns in behavior. Defining the actor correctly is most of the battle, and getting it wrong is how you either let an attack through or punish a whole crowd of innocents who happen to share something where it lives. Once you know to look, you see this defense everywhere on the web. The login form that locks you out after too many wrong tries. The password reset that refuses to send a fifth message in a minute. The search box that throttles a barrage of queries. The checkout that will not let a card be tried over and over. And behind the scenes, the interfaces that apps use to talk to each other, almost all of which cap how often any one caller may ask. Each of these is a place where repetition is the danger, and so each is a place where the quiet throttle stands guard, mostly invisible until you push too hard. And the limits are rarely uniform. The most sensitive actions, the ones an attacker most wants to repeat, like login attempts and code entries, are guarded with tight, unforgiving limits, while harmless reading might be barely throttled at all. The defender spends their strictness where it matters, loosening the grip everywhere the cost of a mistake is low and tightening it wherever a flood would do real harm. So the throttle is not one wall, but a whole landscape of them, set at different heights, each tuned to how dangerous repetition would be at that exact spot. Why slow beats blocked? Here is a subtle point that explains why this defense is so beloved by people who build systems. Outright blocking a source is a heavy, brittle decision. It can be wrong, it can be obvious, and it tells the attacker exactly that they have been caught, inviting them to adapt. Throttling is gentler and craftier. It does not announce itself. It just makes the attack agonizingly slow, dragging a flood down to a crawl, multiplying the time and cost the attacker must spend until the whole effort stops being worth it. You do not have to perfectly identify abuse to defeat it. You only have to make it too slow and too expensive to bother with. A polite, patient no, repeated forever, beats a dramatic wall. The behavioral layer, the smartest versions of this do not hold the limit fixed. They tighten it when something looks suspicious. A visitor behaving completely normally is given a generous allowance and never notices the ceiling exists. But the moment the pattern starts to look automated, the same failed action over and over, perfectly even timing, a sudden surge, the system quietly lowers the limit for that source, clamping down hard precisely where it senses danger and staying loose everywhere else. The throttle becomes adaptive, relaxed for the ordinary and merciless for the suspicious, all without ever needing to be certain. This is the quiet genius of it. The system does not have to prove anyone is an attacker before acting. It just gives everyone a generous benefit of the doubt, then withdraws that generosity in proportion to how strange they start to look. A faint whiff of automation tightens the screw a little, a strong one tightens it hard. The punishment scales with the suspicion, so an innocent who briefly looks odd suffers only a brief, gentle slowdown, while a determined flood is squeezed down to nothing. Nobody is ever formally accused. They are simply, silently, given less and less room the more they behave like a machine. The arms race, of course the other side responds, as it always does. The central move is to stay under each limit by spreading thin, dividing an attack across a huge pool of sources so that every individual one looks calm and slow, while the swarm as a whole still does enormous volume. They slow down, add randomness to their timing to mimic a human rhythm, and rotate through addresses to dodge the counters. And the defender answers by getting better at binding all those scattered requests back to one true actor, and by watching the shape of the whole crowd rather than each visitor alone. It is the familiar endless back and forth. Why the defender still wins. But the advantage here sits quietly with the defender, for a reason worth stating plainly. Every evasion the attacker makes costs them something real. Spreading across thousands of sources means acquiring and managing thousands of sources. Slowing down to look human means the attack takes far longer and achieves far less per hour. The whole point of automation was speed and scale, and rate limiting attacks exactly that, forcing the attacker to surrender the very advantage they came for. The defender does not have to win cleanly. They only have to make speed impossible, and once they do, most attacks simply die of their own slowness. It is a defense built not on catching the attacker, but on bankrupting them, draining their time and resources until the math stops working. And that is a fight the patient side almost always wins. The double edge, it would be dishonest to pretend this is free of cost, so name it. The same throttle that strangles an attack can also catch the innocent. A whole office, a school, a building full of people sharing one network address can be lumped together and limited as if they were a single greedy source. A person on a flaky connection retrying a stuck request can trip a limit and find themselves locked out for no reason they can see. And the limit set too tight can quietly degrade a service for everyone, punishing ordinary use in the name of safety. The art is in drawing the line so it catches the flood without drowning the crowd, and that line is genuinely hard to find. Definitely data them what it is really about. So here is the part to sit with. Underneath the smooth surface of every site you use, there is a quiet metronome counting your actions, deciding in real time whether you are moving at a human pace or something faster and stranger. Most of the time it sits far above anything you would ever do. Invisible, generous, forgotten. You only feel it when you push, and even then it does not slam a door. It just says, gently, not so fast, try again in a moment. It is one of the least dramatic defenses ever built, and one of the most effective, because it turns the attacker's greatest weapon, speed, into the very thing that gives them away. Once you know it is there, you start to feel it everywhere, in every pause before a retry, in every try again later, in the patient, invisible rhythm under the whole web. If this is the kind of thing you find yourself thinking about, the quiet machinery under the everyday internet, then this channel is your sort of place. There is no product to sell you here. It is just the systems, taken apart and explained by someone who has spent a long time on the inside of them. Subscribe and follow the rabbit hole. Next time we are going to look at the 10 digits you hand over without a second thought, your phone number, and the secret score it has been carrying all along. How a service judges that number in an instant, why some numbers are trusted and others are worthless on site, and what that quiet verdict decides about whether you are allowed in.